momentum in the second half of the 20th century, and we have today a wide range of narrow artificial intelligence tools or AI tools that have been invented and used in every sector in the economy, often considered to be commonplace and even invisible. Investor engagement with AI is not new, and examples of this includes the work of the Investor Alliance, where we have a coordinated engagement with technology companies to address risks to individuals' rights to privacy, freedom of expression, non-discrimination, which we collectively refer to as digital rights, and the impact on society at large. But these digital rights and these engagements are underpinned by the many products and services of technology companies, which are powered by artificial intelligence. And so the engagement extends to holding tech companies accountable on their development and deployment of AI in their products and services. But the AI discourse really exploded late last year when OpenAI released ChatGPT, which allowed everyday people, including investors, to experiment with state-of-the-art generative AI tools with tangible consequences in the workplace and around the internet. At the same time, influential voices in Silicon Valley gravely warned us of the existential threats and risks posed by the same technologies they were championing, leaving policymakers scratching their heads about what to do next. Should they regulate AI and risk throttling innovation, or let the machines run amok and risk a Skynet takeover as was portrayed in the Terminator movies? So we're all trying to figure out how to separate the real tech from the hype, much less assess how to evaluate the human rights implications of AI in all its forms. So I'm very pleased to have our keynote speaker today, Dr. Nathalie Maréchal, co-director, privacy and data projects at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and she will demystify some common misconceptions about AI in all its forms and will address some of the salient questions on the impacts on people and planet. Nathalie has been a trusted ally working with the Investor Alliance for a number of years, starting in her prior role with the Ranking Digital Rights, where she led RDR's engagement with government, international and multilateral organizations, and as well was the lead author for RDR's It's the Business Model report series, and her op-ed Targeted Advertising in Ruining the Internet and Breaking the World, to argue that disinformation, hate speech, and other information harms associated with social platform companies are rooted in surveillance capitalism business models, which in the end informed a number of proposals that you in the room today have filed with Alphabet and Meta. We also have our investor discussant and facilitator today, Lydia Kuykendal, Director of Advocacy at Mercy Investment Services, who we all love, and there's really no need to introduce her. So, and it's my great pleasure to have Lydia really facilitate the session, so I get to step down and listen and enjoy the next session. But Lydia will provide her comments after Nathalie has delivered hers, and she will also lead the open discussion with investors, as we've left a significant chunk of time for question and answers. So with that, over to Nathalie, and thank you for spending your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Anita, for the introduction and for inviting me to here today. It's been really a pleasure to meet many of you who I've been seeing on Zooms for a number of years in real life. It turns out you are, in fact, tridimensional. And I hope you have the same impression of me. As Lydia mentioned, or Anita, sorry, as Anita mentioned, I'm now with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We are a leading tech and human rights advocacy organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels. I'm co-director of the Privacy and Data Project, which may beg the question, what parts of CDT are not about privacy and data? And I'm not really sure that I have an answer to that. Because at this point, we're basically all the AI team. In fact, I'm pretty sure everyone in DC is an AI expert, or at least their boss wants them to be at this point. Next slide, please. So I want to start off by being clear that this is not going to be a computer science lecture. First of all, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a social scientist with a background in human rights, international communication, and internet in general. But more importantly, most of us don't actually need to know the computer science details of AI. We need to understand what AI is and what it does and how it gets built at a high level. it's important to know who benefits, who gets harmed, and how to cut through the hype around AI. And it's virtually all hype right now. And then we also need to understand how to ensure that AI doesn't become a get out of corporate social responsibility free card for companies. So Anita mentioned that the history of AI goes back for a very long time. This is not a history lesson either, but there are some really, really cool books on the topic if you're interested in that sort of thing, as I am. The important thing that I want to point out here is that going back to the 19th century in particular, there's a big effort to use machines to first augment and eventually replace physical labor, but also to augment and eventually replace cognitive labor. And it's taken us much longer time to get to the same level of development for replacing cognitive labor, brain labor you do with your brain, as opposed to labor we do with our bodies or with the bodies of animals or using other forms of energy. But a lot of the same principles there apply. Next slide. If you only remember one thing from what I say today, is that Skynet isn't real. General artificial intelligence or you can say either GAI or AGI. It means the same thing. They're both a mouthful. It's not real. It makes for good movies. It also makes for some bad movies. It also makes for some engagingly terrible television, which was a chief way that I spent my pandemic time. And I do have recommendations if you're into that sort of thing as well. But I really, really want you to remember that this is not real. It is probably not going to be real. And even if it is ever real, it is not going to be real for a very long time. Now, there are a lot of people out there who really sound like they might like it to be real. They get very excited about the possibility that it could be real. Some of those people are employed as screenwriters, including screenwriters who were until very recently on strike with the Writers Guild, and we'll get into that. Some people are very scared that it could become real. But strangely enough, there's a lot of overlap between those Venn diagrams. And that's kind of strange. Next slide, please. So that's where we get into this existential risk dialogue discourse that you may have seen on TV or around the internet. So a lot of people at the top of AI companies and kind of throughout them as well have a lot of claims about emergent capabilities. They claim that in the process of training an AI system to do something or other, that it started behaving in ways that made it sound kind of human, that made it seem like it had consciousness. And certainly with generative AI, and we'll get more into what that is exactly in a minute. There certainly are some text exchanges that can see a little alarming. I think it was Kevin Roose for the New York Times who had a really disturbing encounter with ChatGPT, where you have to be careful not to ascribe agency to a computer system, I think, but the dialogue certainly made it sound like whoever or whatever Kevin was talking to was trying to convince him to leave his wife, which I'm sure she was not super thrilled about. But this alarmist discourse, whether or not people actually believe what they're saying, and I think it's usually kind of a fool's errand to try to discern intent behind what people say, but the effect that it has is to distract from regulating against the more immediate harms, because AI is harming people now. And I'll get into exactly how it's doing that in a minute. But it's very easy when you're making tons of money from rolling out all kinds of AI tools that claim to make it easier to hire people, or make it easier to decide who to fire, or make it easier to kick people off welfare payrolls, or decide who should go into hospice or who should get life-saving care. All of these types of decisions. It's saying that, oh no, wait, the robots might rise up and nuke us all into oblivion, makes for a really good no over here distraction when you really want to keep policymakers from focusing on the harm that your products are doing today. Next slide, please. There is a real existential crisis though, and that's climate. I don't know why things are dinging. I would. No. Let's not make the joke that undermines my point. It's too easy. I'm going to keep talking until I'm told otherwise. I don't need to convince all of you about the urgency of climate change and the importance of ESG mechanisms to rein back the impact that the use of fossil fuels and so on has on the planet. Here's just a few data points, and I'll encourage you to look more into this as part of your own engagement. ChatGPT needs to drink or use up a half liter of water for a conversation of every 20 and 50 inquiries. That's how much the data centers heat up, and that's the water that they need to be able to cool down. Just when you're going back and forth with ChatGPT about help planning your mom's birthday party or something. Google's data center water consumption increased by about 20% year on year in the 21 to 22 period, which coincides with a real uptick in AI-related activity at the company. And if model sizes continue growing at the current rate, and model size refers to the amount of data that an AI system needs to ingest in order to work. Some estimates place computing costs in excess. We do need to leave. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
I would much rather be listening to you. All right. So I just want to speak to building security, and the building will be making an announcement in a minute about what we should be doing and whether we should be leaving. So we can continue with the session right now. And if those instructions change, we will hear that over the loudspeakers in a minute.
cool. So anyway, climate, that's the existential risk you should be worried about, not the robots nuking us all into oblivion. Next slide. I said general AI doesn't exist, but narrow AI that is focused on doing one thing at a time absolutely does exist, and it's everywhere. I'm not going to read that list everywhere, but if you use Google Maps, if you use Face ID to log into your phone, if you have insurance, if you have gotten a job in the last 5 years, if you have even applied for a job in the last 5 years, if someone in your life is a student anywhere from elementary through college and graduate school, if you know someone who's taken the bar exam, if you go on the internet in general and you see ads, if you use social media, in all of those cases, AI is recommending things to you, making decisions for you, making decisions about you. And a lot of the times it happens in the background, you're not aware. Maybe everything's fine. Maybe you're actually being discriminated against. Maybe you're being shown ads for housing that your neighbor is not being shown ads for that same housing opportunity because the computer decided that you, for whatever reason, were a more desirable tenant. Some of those factors are illegal to use in showing housing advertisements. There's really a big host of issues here, and that's why I think it's less useful to think in terms of how is AI changing everything, but more in terms of the specific area that I already work on, where we know people's rights are implicated. How is that evolving? How is the risk changing? How are the harms evolving in light of the adoption of AI in this particular sector? Next slide, please. So it is useful to know at a very high level how AI works. At a very basic level, you have historical data about the world, about some phenomenon. There are machine learning algorithms. They learn things based on statistics. It's all about correlation and multivariate correlation and so on. And it comes up with a predictive data. Once you've trained the model, you can show it new data, and it says, okay, well, based on what I've learned about similar data in the historical patterns, this is what I think should happen in this particular situation so that we're keeping the same trends constant. All AI, and then you can have human training and feedback to kind of tweak the details there. And then you can repeat that loop over and over and over again. Next slide. So what's the problem? The really obvious one is that history is full of discrimination and harmful behavior. And if you just have data about all the terrible things that people have done to each other in the past, and you say, you know what, let's use a computer to do more of that, you're just going to keep doing really terrible things to people. You're just going to use computers to do it instead of other people. And that's not great. And so that's where we get terms like digital redlining, where I'm sure people are familiar with the use of redlining and denying loans to notably African Americans in the 20th century. There are very similar practices that happen digitally. Now, Amazon, and I do want to give them credit for making this public and not actually using this dreadful algorithm, but several years ago made headlines by saying that they had trained an algorithm based on years worth of hiring data, who'd applied for jobs, who'd ultimately been hired, who'd been successful, and so on, and used it to screen new applicants. But then they realized that the top two factors that the algorithm thought would predict someone would have a successful career at Amazon was one, being male, and two, being named Jared. So they realized that was garbage and they didn't use it. And they, to their credit, made it public that this is a terrible way to make decisions. But unfortunately, a lot of companies are making similar types of decisions with similar nonsense logic without questioning it and just shipping it out. And a lot of times nobody knows. And the same thing happens again with predictive policing. Predictive policing is based on the idea that historical arrest records and records of incidents are going to predict what's going to happen in the future. There's a lot of problems with that. The main one is that arrest records are not an accurate reflection of crime happening. Oh. Well, that was clear as mud. Are we getting a fax? And okay, next slide. Can I have the next slide? Okay. So one of the big ironies here, and something where I think it's really useful for you as investors to focus your attention on, is that for something that is meant to replace human labor, AI requires a staggering amount of human labor to actually put together. This is really low-wage, precarious work. There are data labeling factories all around the world that offer people, pennies to categorize things as cat or dog, or danger, not danger, breast cancer, not cancer, et cetera, et cetera. There's a service called Amazon Mechanical Turk that makes it possible for people anywhere to do this kind of piecework from anywhere in the world. If you want to learn more about this, the book Ghost Work is like really the classic on this. But a lot of the discourse around the AI hype is all about like, we're just going to magically have machines do work and people can like be lazy and hang out. But no, it's actually shifting labor from decently paid, trained, expert people with well-rounded jobs and well-rounded lives into this really, I don't want to say, well, backbreaking, depending on your actual computer setup, but certainly often emotionally triggering, because you're looking a lot of this, if you think about content moderation algorithms, right? For an algorithm to be able to detect what's hate speech and what's not, or what's sexual conduct or what's not, or what is images depicting cruel things being done to children and animals or not, a human being has to actually look at those things and say, this yes, this no, this no, this yes, this no, for hours and hours and hours on end. And again, under very poor labor conditions, very poor pay conditions. And once the company has the data that it needs for that particular algorithm to be trained, the work goes away. They move it to a different country where the people have expertise on something else, or where the labor costs are lower, or where the energy costs are lower, or for whatever reason, and poof, all these people are left, they had a terrible job to start with, now they have no job. So this is really an important and I think underappreciated issue in AI policy. Next slide. So I finally get to generative AI, which is all the hype up here. So I said, if there's one thing you come away with, general AI isn't real. If there's two things to come away with, generative AI is not the only kind of AI. So generative AI, so that's ChatGPT and the new Bing search engine and, customer service chatbots and that sort of thing. They're really just, there's not well, some of the time you actually are interacting with the person who's pretending to be an AI, which is like a whole different level of mind, but they're just statistical models predicting the next word in a sentence given a set of constraints. So if you use Google Docs, often it'll tell you, it'll suggest like the next word in your sentence for you, or Gmail does that too. Imagine ChatGPT is just that, but bigger. And so you can build chatbots that are tailored to very specific kinds of interactions, different kinds of subject matter, and so on. And that's a really big and growing industry. And those like very narrowly designed chatbots tend to have less of the making stuff up problems than ChatGPT as a generalized ChatGPT does. Okay. And there's also generative AI that can build audio, that can build images and video, and they work similarly, right? It's just based on statistics and prediction. Next slide. I'm used to talking over a 3-year-old, so this is nothing. Not to mention the 30+ lawyers in my office. But generative AI is not magic. It's not, a person inside a machine, but it does pose real challenges. For one, and you're going to hear a lot about this over the next year as we run up to an unprecedented number of elections, not just in the US, but worldwide, it drastically lowers the barrier to entry for disinformation, fraud, impersonation, harassment, and a slew of other terrible things that involve language. And it lowers those barriers in a few different ways. One, in terms of speed, right? It's a lot faster to get ChatGPT or some similar product to write something for you than to write it yourself. Second, in terms of volume, in the same amount of time, you can write many more disinforming social media posts telling people that the election is on Wednesday. And also in terms of personalizing and targeting disinformation to specific groups of people or even to specific individuals. Another challenge is that's related to that is to crack down on these malicious and harmful uses while respecting free expression, and in the US, the First Amendment. And I'm happy to go into to some more detail about that. There's really no easy answer here. And then a third thing is that there are some really thorny legal questions here around liability. When someone harms someone else and generative AI was involved somewhere along the way, who does the harmed person get to sue? And for what? We don't know. Copyright. I'm sure you're familiar with all the authors that are suing OpenAI for using their books to train AI. Very interesting to see how that's going to play out. And then there's the future of work. Now there's, all of our, desk-based jobs. Like in some ways, it might be easy to use a Gen AI assistant to help you write emails or to read this 100-page report and summarize it for me so I can decide whether I want to read it, right? Like stuff that you might have given to an intern a few years ago or even last week, you might give to an AI assistant. So that raises all kinds of questions about if there's no pipeline for, young people to come in and start doing this kind of work and kind of be like the apprentice model of doing a job, if the first job that can be done by a human is really at the middle manager level, how do you actually get people up to that point? And then, of course, there's all the even, I think, more fundamental issues that have come up in the Hollywood strikes with both the Writers Guild and the SAG-AFTRA strike. Next slide. So I really like this quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I kind of feel that way about AI in that I don't really need to know the finer details of how it works. But again, I need to know who's holding the magic wand, what they're going to do with it, what are the risks to me and to other people and other things that I care about, and what we can do to rein that all in. But the other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that AI is a marketing term. You might find a lot of people, and many of those people work for companies that make money off of AI, try to drag you into semantic arguments over what is and is not AI. Just do not let yourself get dragged into those conversations. It's kind of the yet another iteration on the annoying bro who just wants you to debate him. Just say no to those kinds of arguments. Is it a computer that is meant to replace or augment human cognitive labor? Yes, then it's AI or close enough. You can treat it that way. Next slide. So here I'm going to go through fairly quickly because you'll have the slides later. Some questions to ask yourself. First of all, is it a scam? Like, is someone trying to scam you yet? And two, does it actually do what it says on the tin, or is it traced on proxy variables that aren't quite right? One example of a proxy variable is, again, arrest records as a proxy for crime, right? We know there's all kinds of bias that gets introduced there. This is a very, very common pitfall. Next slide. What are the biases and impacts that are built in? They could come in through the training data. It could come in terms of who's going to benefit from the tech being used, who stands to be harmed. What are the second, third, et cetera, order harms and benefits? So kind of like, what are the dominoes, right? The immediate impact will be this, and this in turn will affect that, and so on and so forth. And then as investors in particular, it's really useful for you to be able to ask about the steps that the company is taking to mitigate and remedy those risks. Next slide. Transparency and explainability are big buzzwords here. I think we're very close to getting some more clarity, hopefully, on legal requirements in the EU moving forward, as they're getting close to negotiating the final text of the AI Act. Does the system provide an adequate level of explainability to end users, to affected people, to investors, to anyone else whose business it is to know? What's it supposed to do? How does it do it? And is there a redress mechanism? Because everything goes wrong, clearly. There's got to be a way to say, hey, something's wrong here. Let's investigate and fix it. Is there transparency about data collection and data processing, not just for the building of the model, but when it's actually acting in the world? And can people opt out of being impacted by this AI system? And if no, why not? There are cases where no. So for example, I can't go on a social media platform and say, I don't feel like being subject to the AI powered content moderation system. I want to just be able to use racial slurs all the time and not have any computers tell me no. That's not a choice you get to make if you want to use that social media platform, right? Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart. But there are other cases like, no, I do not want to have my face scanned in order to get on your flight. I would like you to look at my passport in the time-honored tradition of our people, right? So it's important to know which of those two scenarios you're falling into. Next slide. So because in my family we express affection by giving reading assignments, here are some recommendations I have for you, but there's a lot of really, really great literature. And it's no accident that most of these books are written by women and non-binary people of color. That's not an accident. And there's a lot more books similar to these that you can find at any library or on Bookshop. Not the other places where people can buy books. Next slide. Oh, that was my secret slide in case it comes up. So let's end here. I have no idea whether I went under or over because that was a little too confusing to keep track of time.
Thanks, Tyler. I think it's something we're going to have to be asking all cases and things that isn't completely disturbing. But that's going to be today. So I'm going to talk really briefly about a couple of engagements that have been involved in around this topic. First off is Meta. And Meta has this reputation, and I would say well earned, for being a difficult company to work with. Now, it's interesting because Michaela Gregory at NEI Investments and I co-lead this Meta engagement, and they'll talk to us. Actually, they're relatively accessible. Now, what they're not is fruitful. So we've had maybe 3 or 4 conversations with them in the last 18 months, all around a proposal that we filed that was centered on targeted advertising. You're probably familiar with the fact that Meta gets 97 to 98% of their total revenues from targeted advertising. Their entire business model is based on this specific feature that is run by AI. So we've asked them to do a human rights impact assessment on that particular feature. They have not done it. What they have done is point us to their inaugural and then very recently their second annual human rights report, neither of which address the topic. So they'll talk a lot about their salient human right risks, and they have a lot of them. It's not that they don't have a lot of problems to fix. My issue with them right now is that they have annual revenues greater than 100 countries of the world, GDPs. And so you can't come to me with a problem you created, almost entirely you created, and then say, well, we can't solve it because we have a lot of other problems we've also created. And so trying to sort of dig down with them into why, and we all know why it isn't. It's because, again, it's literally their entire revenue stream. They don't want to look at it. But as Nathalie pointed out, it's not just a revenue stream. It's not even theoretical harm and human rights violations. It's currently happening harm and human rights violations. We know it's happening. It's happened in the past. It's happening right now. It will happen in the future. So why don't we, for once, be proactive about something? Well, it's not even at this point proactive, but why don't we actually address a problem as it is currently happening instead of waiting for the world to collapse in on itself, and then maybe we try to patchwork some sort of response. The other one I'll talk about is a relatively new work stream, and Meg is in the middle here somewhere. Raise your hand, Meg. So if you're interested in this, you can talk to her in the ICCR Health Group. And Rachel Nishimoto at Parnassus is really the mastermind behind this, but we're doing some work with health tech and AI. And that's a few different companies we've engaged. I sent a letter to Amazon, and those of you that engage Amazon can probably imagine the response I got back from that. And we've talked to United Health Group. We've talked to a couple of the electronic health records companies. To Nathalie's point, every company now is an AI company. Healthcare is certainly no exception to that. And when you take something like HIPAA data or any kind of sensitive personal health information and combine it with AI, it can get very scary very quickly, not just in terms of privacy, but in terms of discrimination. United Health Group's subsidiary Optum, a few years back, Nathalie mentioned proxies earlier, and it was found that they were using, in one of their algorithms that decided who got care, they were using basically consumption of health services as a proxy for health status. So what that meant was a lot of their Black patients did not utilize the healthcare system as much as their white patients. So the algorithm said that means they must not be as sick. Now, I think we all recognize that what it really means is that they just didn't have access. Oh, I was hoping. And so that, that was a few years back, and we talked to United Health Group and they say, well, we fixed it. Okay. Can you disclose any data to show that? No. And that is generally how these conversations have gone, not just with United, but with a lot, pretty much every company we talk to in the health AI space and just in the general big tech space. They're not particularly interested in disclosing data to show how this problem could be prevented, or, to Nathalie's point, when it does absolutely happen, how you're going to then remediate it. And I will stop there and take moderator privileges to ask the first question, so y'all can think of really good ones. Nathalie, nice to see you. I was wondering, in the spaces in which we work, are there examples, either really good or really bad, from specific companies that you can share about the governance of AI?
So I think the most important decision that a company can make about AI is deciding when not to use it. And so that Amazon case, which is several years old at this point, but it's clear enough that it makes for a good teaching moment, was, look, we know there was all kinds of bias in our hiring decisions going back, across our corporate history. The whole point of us revising our hiring practices is that we want our workforce to stop looking the same way that it does right now. So this is actually a terrible way to do things. We're not going to do it, or at least we're not going to use this particular algorithm. I'm not convinced that they're not using. I'm quite certain that they are using algorithms in some way to screen resumes. I think another, an underappreciated tool in, at least in the US, in governing AI is privacy and data protection. There's one of the core components of the GDPR, and this is also something that my organization fights for in the US, is data minimization and the closely related purpose limitation principle. Together, what that means is that you can only collect a piece of data if you actually need it for a real business purpose that the customer or the user or the affected person actually wants and expects. So that, to my mind at least, rules out targeted advertising. And you can only use it for that specific purpose, not for other things. And so one example of how companies get in trouble for violating that is that they'll ask you to set up two-factor authentication using your phone number to identify yourself. And then they'll use that to create like an advertising record for you. And they've gotten into trouble with Twitter in particular, for example, notably got in trouble with the FTC. Yay. Okay.
No, we're done.
Yeah, if they don't collect the data, a piece of data about you, they can't use it to create discriminatory and harmful products. And I think that basic fact is a big part of the reason why there's such strong corporate pushback against privacy and data protection in this country.
Audience questions. Great.
I want to sort of like ask just play a little bit devil's advocate here. I spent the last couple of weeks in the working group looking into biotechnology. Speaking to a lot of investors in that space, they really says, look, I think that work has generated AI use in that space. It's generated a lot of good, speeding up time to identify important medication to improve global health, right? So Novo Nordisk's GDP income is not bigger than the Danish GDP in multiples, right? So what do you say about how to weigh the positive versus the negatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one that I get asked a lot. My job as a public interest advocate is not to look for the good in products, because that's what companies' job is to do. My job is to ask the uncomfortable questions and to nitpick at all the bad things, how things can go wrong. So there are lots. If I should say, a bunch of questions of what you should ask about an AI product or an AI tool or system. There are tons and tons and tons of applications that pass all those tests with flying colors, and most of them do really really astute, really smart, kind of really detailed things that are really interesting to the people who use them every day, but are not exciting to put on a headline, and are just not the kind of things that advocates get riled up about one way or another. So I'm not saying that AI is bad. I hope I didn't give that impression. I am saying, however, that there are a lot of bad ways to use AI, and that it's really, really important to put those safeguards in place right? To draw a box around, this is how we protect people on the planet. Around that, do whatever you want. Come up with all kinds of great ideas. But inside this box, we're not going there.
And I'll just add really quickly to that, I think my job, and I told Pat she's about to retire, so she can't fire me anyway. I think part of our job, and I'll agree with what Nathalie said, the companies have a lot of cheerleaders, and AI is here, right? Like the horse is out of the barn. So I think we can easily acknowledge, hey, there's a lot of cool stuff you do with AI. I love Uber. I use it all the time. But I think the onus is going to be on us and groups like us to acknowledge and tease out the bad. Otherwise, I think the narrative that's going to run is AI is good, and everybody's happy. So
maybe just to follow up with that, a few weeks ago, of course, Senator Schumer gathered a bunch of people in a big room and people talking about cage fighting one another and things like that. And somehow they managed to agree on some of the concerns, which automatically kind of raises my alarms in terms of what their agenda and where they're looking to go with this. Above and beyond, like, are there some things you can point to in terms of things that we ought to be trying to convey to regulators and others, or people who would draft some of that, especially around those kinds of questions, or some of your thoughts on what they talked about that day that was reported?
Yeah. So that first meeting, so let me back up a little bit. There's a lot going on at the federal government in AI governance. And I started to address that in the presentation, and then realized that it would take me like 2 days to get through it. So I decided not to. Last fall, the White House released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that goes into, what are the rights that people have, to explainable AI, to recourse, what are the kinds of harms that the government should be paying particular attention to, whether it's race, gender, the intersection with disability rights, et cetera, et cetera. And right now, there's a really detailed process going on throughout the entire federal government to map out what does that mean on an agency by agency level in terms of those agencies' procurement practices, development of their own AI tools, whether the data that they generate in the course of doing their work should be used for training AI, and if so, under what conditions, for what purposes, et cetera, et cetera. My team wrote and submitted no fewer than 14, I think it was, substantive comments to agencies on the topic of AI just this summer alone. We were basically a team of AI comment churning machines, and we did not use AI to write any of them. We thought about it, but decided that actually didn't make sense. So there is actually a whole lot going on. And then as far as the Congress goes, there's a lot of proposals out there. What Senator Schumer is trying to do is to set up some roundtables to educate the members of the Senate as well as the staff on the technology itself, on what the stakes are, what the trade-offs are, what the potential governance mechanisms even are in the U.S., like what can be done through regulation or through rulemaking, what requires actual legislation, and so on and so forth. And so this first roundtable, or listening sessions, I think is how he's calling them, was intended to be kind of the kickoff, where it's like the big names, big media splash, not meant to be particularly substantive. And in the end, it wasn't, but that wasn't the purpose. And so now that we get to have a government for another month and a half, there's going to be a further series of these that are more geared at the working level, getting into it with people from industry, from civil society, from academia, like really getting into the nitty-gritty details of it.
I was really curious about your essentially comparisons about hiring an HR, because organizational psychologists have been doing sort of basically a baby AI thing for roughly 100 years. And what kind of came out of it was that IQ was discriminatory if you didn't use it in combination with a bunch of other factors. So I'm really curious if you see some ways to sort of tame the beast, so to speak, with regard to AI and HR in particular. Another thing, does it make sense to push the regulators to tell them, we're not guinea pigs. This should be covered under human experimentation as opposed to, existing law about human experimentation, as opposed to treating this as privacy or something else, because the fact is that we should be treated ethically. And that's already under, we have law about that. And that people have to be fully informed about their participation in studies and experimentation. And I'm curious if you have a take on that.
Yeah, so on the topic of HR, so that's not my area of expertise. I'll refer you to the work of my really wonderful colleague, Matt Scherer, who leads our work on technology and on workers and technology at CDT. And he's been doing a lot of thinking for years now on hiring algorithms, worker surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. So, and he's written a lot, and I know that because I've edited a lot. So I'll have to punt to Matt, to my colleague Matt on that. To your broader point about IQ and everything, there's a really interesting history, and you can read some of it in those books that I recommended about the god-awfully racist origins of the field of statistics. I'm not saying let's not do statistics. There's still math, there's still numbers in there, but the white men who pioneered the field of statistics did so in service to their belief in eugenics, right? And in the same way that Carl Linnaeus, who we get the Linnaean classification system from, was really interested in classifying different types of human beings based on what their bodies look like and saying who's superior and inferior to whom, right? We can still find that it's useful for categorizing, I don't know, different types of snakes or fish or something, while rejecting it for human beings. The statistics, historically, is really, really messed up, the history of it. And then I'm sorry, your last question was?
Human experimentation.
Oh, human experimentation.
Treating it instead of as data privacy as experimentation. Maybe that's a way around this, to get to, instead of having to create a whole new paradigm for data privacy that most people are kind of like, well, I just buy stuff, I don't care. But if you make it a situation where they're not allowed to experiment on people, or they have to get buy-in from people, then maybe that will give us an alternative method to get to where we need to be with regard to how we're treated.
Yeah, I think legally there's actually not that many tools there, but there is plenty of established law that you can use to go after distinct practices, right? Like one of the kind of techno-chauvinist tenets is oh, it involves technology, therefore it's completely different than anything else, the old rules don't apply, is to say, no, actually, you're still hurting people. The fact that you're using fancy computers to do it doesn't make it any less illegal, right? And just a few months ago, the FTC, the DOJ, the EEOC, and a whole another alphabet soup of DC agencies issued a joint statement saying, just because you're using AI to do a crime doesn't make it any less of a crime. We're going to go after you. Stop it with the AI fraud. It's still fraud, right? And so a lot of the work that, again, the lawyers who talk over me at my office have been doing for this past several years is mapping out exactly what all those legal authorities are, persuading the agencies that have those authorities to use them to their full extent, and then figuring out, okay, where are the gaps and where do we need to, what are those, and how do we fill those gaps? And we did identify the lack of comprehensive federal privacy legislation as a fundamental gap that we need in order to fully protect people's rights across the spectrum.
We've got one in the back in the chat.
Hi, Vanda Brunsting. So I think my question is for Lydia. I'm curious to know if there's been any work here at ICCR to connect, I guess, if you look at tech companies, and for lack of a better way, the ESG issues. So the climate issues that were raised, the human rights issues, which would be the S, and then of course, there's the governance problems with the way that tech companies are set up with dual class shares. And then there's the workplace issues around the impact that they're having on, promoting precarious work and really driving work down. And it just seems to me that, again, on the harms front, they have an outsized impact on other companies in the way that their governance is set up, but also in some of the social issues and workplace issues and environmental problems that they have not been managing. And so is there a way to think about that comprehensively when we're addressing them and engaging with the companies?
Boy, I love and hate that question. So in the last session, Stafford mentioned there were a few companies that had 10 plus proposals. I'd be willing to bet they were all big tech companies for this exact reason. And I'm glad I see Lauren at the mic. I was going to force her to come up here anyway. So I think the answer to that is that when you have companies that impact literally every walk of life, of course, that means every issue area wants to talk to them about something, dealing with issue fatigue, dealing with, just availability of the right person at the table becomes a real concern. There's a lot of good work with Nadira's Amazon group. Obviously, Anita mobilizes a lot of work around the other big tech companies. So yes, these are absolutely things that are considered and talked a lot about. I think finding the perfect solution is still something we're all waiting for. So welcome ideas. Lauren, you want to go ahead?
I'm too short. Okay, here we go. Actually, I'm going to ask a question. I guess one question I would have for both of you would be, like, how do we cut through the noise? And what are the proper terms we need to see from companies? So like you hear ethical, you hear knowledgeable, you hear there's a responsible. But if you were gonna, in one sentence say, what should a company be, what kind of language should a company be using around AI practices? And like, how do we ask them to know and show? Like, who should be at the table in dialogues, for example? Come on,
Lauren, I called on you on purpose, and you do this. So I think, it's a really good question, and I think it actually sort of harkens back. See, I'm just going to politicize this and answer the question I want to answer to Nathalie's earlier point, which is that the companies often will try to. So this is demystifying AI. They will try to mystify AI. And they will use different words that are basically all nonsense words or all mean the same thing, but they will try to trip you up with this exact thing. So I think that there is a lot of utility, and I think it is going to be really important moving forward that we do agree on a glossary of terms or a shared language. Whether, I'm not going to do that right now, but I do think that it's something that not only would help us in discussing things with companies, but also amongst ourselves. I think it makes us feel more comfortable and feel more confident that we are capable of talking to these companies when we're all saying the same thing. Nathalie.
Yeah, I actually don't like the ethics framework at all, because it's really easy to bend to whatever the company wants ethics to be. You can have, ethics are there, ethics as a field of study is great. Don't get me wrong. But ethics as a way of constraining corporate behavior is not very useful, because I see a lot of nods, so I'm not going to belabor this point. You can kind of mold it to fit whatever your belief system is. And if your belief system is nihilist capitalism, you can come up with an ethics that fits that. I'm not going to rest any better at night knowing that. So that's why I really favor the language of human rights and civil rights, which are, roughly coterminous. We can, at least for the purpose of this conversation, and legal compliance, because that's something that companies will sit up and listen to. And you can say, hey, are you compliant with, is your hiring algorithm compliant with labor law? Is your targeted advertising system compliant with public accommodations law and non-discrimination in hiring, credit, education, et cetera, et cetera? And you can point to in areas where there's not a relevant U.S. legal framework, you can point to EU law, because many of these companies are big enough that they need to comply. And they're adopting different strategies of either applying EU law globally or kind of bifurcating their operations so that there's a more law-respecting, law-abiding product in the EU market versus YOLO for the rest of the world. And each company is going to make that decision based on a lot of different factors, but you can point to that. You can also point to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the respect, protect, and remedy framework and get into concrete human rights that way, where there is a lot of jurisprudence that may not be legally binding in U.S. courts, but that at least is much more concrete than, ethics.
One question, and that would be, I'm a little bit concerned about the EU AI Act. I've been following it, and I think there are a lot of loopholes on the category around risk. Can you talk about that? And I think there's been heavy lobbying on the risk parameters, which could basically give any company a loophole to report out.
Yeah, absolutely. At least on a high level. I'm lucky to have colleagues in Europe who focus on this 100% of the time so that I don't have to master all the details. But the EU AI Act, in addition to sounding like old McDonald parody sometimes, it's just hard to say. As a risk-based framework where different AI systems are categorized as either having high risks for people, and so that would include decisions about benefits, decisions about hiring, education, like something that has a serious effect on somebody's lives, versus low risk, where maybe like the filter that gives me bunny ears on Instagram is not high risk, right? Probably not. And so that depending on where you fall in that category, the company needs to do, kinds of impact assessments and audits, and there are transparency obligations and so on. And so now that we're getting close to the text presumably getting locked down and voted on, there are some loopholes that are emerging, as you say, Lauren, around when companies can just be exempt altogether. And I'll admit that I'm not super conversant in the details of that, but my colleagues at CDT just have a blog post explaining all those things. And then another kind of big open question is biometric recognition in public spaces, with many advocates calling for a ban for real-time remote identification, with some allowances for post-remote. So, when going back and looking at footage and looking for a particular person, or non-remote. So certainly you can still use your face to open your phone, or at airports, the using a computer to see if your passport in fact belongs to you. Doesn't seem to be a ton of debate about that use case. And then there's another area of debate is exceptions for law enforcement, intelligence, and migration contexts, right? And so, I think irony is not even the right term, but it's just heartbreaking that, one of the situations where you have the most vulnerable people in the world is the place where lawmakers are thinking of just saying these people don't have rights. So that's really disheartening. But the Parliament's the EU Parliament's position is the one that human rights organizations, civil society are basically behind. And so the what's called the trilogue is kind of the final step of the process between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, is something that's going on right now.
And I do think I think we're getting the hook. Natalie, such a trooper. Thank you so very much for being here. And thanks everybody. Oh, wait. I promise. I see you, Asab. It's okay. 355, engaging asset managers is the next panel.
And just before we end, I just wanted to
kind of touch on a couple of points that came about, because we are doing some work on tech and human rights, and just following through on some of the questions. So in fact, Access Now and a couple of our colleagues in Europe just approached us to really start to help them to try and close some of the loopholes on the AI Act, and are looking for investors who are willing to join us on a panel to talk to the commissioner and lawmakers in Germany. So if you're interested, all right, Lauren, I'll come to you for that. I just wanted to say that on October 24th as well, we are going to be having actually CDT again speaking to us. So I was just going to pull out the details. At 9:30 on the 24th, we will have some of Nathalie's colleagues from Europe speaking to us. Two things we're going to cover is tech companies' role in election integrity. And there is going to be a little bit of a focus on the US. I think it's Dean Jackson that's going to be speaking. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the legislative landscape regarding tech and human rights. And we have Asha Allen, also from CDT, going to speak to that a little bit more EU focused. So those who are already on our tech and human rights listserv would have this information. If any of you want to join that listserv and participate, it's open to anybody. So just get in touch. Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks, Nathalie, and thanks, Lydia. That was wonderful. Thank you.